seeing Craig? He doesn't judge me.
I don't.
You are nothing but judgment. You always were. Saint Tim the fucking holy.
Where are you going now, the meat rack?
We locals call it the rack. Yeah, I might end up there. I'm sure you don't want to come, considering what a fucking self-righteous bore you've turned into.
Hi everyone, I'm Marcus Jones, awards editor at IndieWire. We are so excited to kick off the day with fellow travelers. Are you excited? There we go. So to start, please welcome creator, showrunner Ron Eisweiner. Star Matt Bomer. Director Daniel Minahan. And composer Paul Leonard Morgan. I know this was a long journey, but as producers, to speak to this, did it feel like this was the right particular moment for the show?
Yes, I would say because we were ready, and and Matt, it had been like a 3-year journey, I think, right? And we had Dan, we were just ready to go. So, and you know, as you do these things, and Matt came on as an EP and playing Hawkins Fuller. Poor Matt we had to keep, you know, as you know, you're developing something and you haven't gotten the green light yet, and it feels right. And I think also because of the political content, and I don't know how much, if you've all seen much of the show, but there's a important plot about Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn and their persecution of homosexuals from the government. And Roy Cohn, as you all may know, was the mentor to one of our current presidential candidates. So there is a real relevancy to the show right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dan and Paul, how did you approach setting the tone of this project?
Yeah, I have to say the tone was very clearly communicated in the scripts. It was one of the things that really spoke to me right off the bat, were, you know, Ron's amazing scripts. So as the director, producer of the piece, it was my job to kind of protect that and enforce it. And, you know, Ron and I went up to Toronto, where we filmed this, before everyone else, and started bringing in all our creative team and meeting with people. But one of the main things we did was we went through and toned the scripts. And that was extremely important. What was important to me, you know, before you start a series, you usually present a kind of a visual lookbook and kind of a presentation of what you want it to look and feel like. And the thing that was really important to me was that we stuck to the immediacy of the material. And it was always the emotion in the foreground, that we were not making a series that was pretending to be filmed in the 1950s. I wanted it to be very accessible to people. And so that was a big concern, and a big, you know, we made a big effort. So, and during that time when Ron and I went through the scripts together and toned them, and Ron did revise some things, we kind of came up with these manifestos of things, of like behavior and how queer people, you know, communicated and coded. And we, you know, learned, when our costume designer, Joseph, came on, you know, there were things that he brought to us, like people would send each, you know, coded by matching their tie to their socks or their, you know, pocket square. So it was really interesting going deep into the research, but I have to say the tone of it was really beautifully established in the scripts. And then we just wanted to really bring out all the feels, you know, in every scene. And when we started considering composers, I was a huge fan of Paul's from his series, Tales from the Loop, that he scored, which was one of the most beautiful scores I'd ever heard in a series. And that was very clear to me. Ron was excited right away by it. And we actually temped a lot of the edits in the beginning with his other scores.
Cool.
It's the first I've actually heard of this, because when I saw it, it didn't have any temp music on it. So this is quite interesting to know.
Well, I kind of was trained to do cuts without score at first.
Yeah.
And so we also may have sent them to you without.
No, I mean, utterly perfect, because as a composer, what you don't want to do is to go, well, I've already done this, I'll try and replicate it. But I think what's wonderful about seeing you three here is that scripts, wonderful actors, wonderful director, I come on and all I get to do is just make it even more beautiful, which is really hard because it's already beautifully acted, beautifully written, beautifully directed. It truly is. It doesn't happen that much where you don't have to rescue something to a certain degree. And one of the things that Ron always said to me was like, I don't want to over-egg the pudding. You don't need to overwrite this. There's so many things. I think the only discussions we ever really had were about negative space, about not having to write the whole thing. Your performances were so wonderful that a lot of the time writing music underneath it, it just felt like it was making it too cheesy emotional. Whereas if you just let it breathe and occasionally there's just a note here and a note there, it's way more effective than doing it. So again, going back to what you said about the tone of the scripts, it's the tone of the music as well. It's trying to come up with the melodies, trying to come up with the sound of it, but without actually over-egging the pudding to begin with.
Well, he makes it sound very logical, but really what he does is like a kind of alchemy. It's absolutely magic, placing music correctly. And also Ron has an incredible skill with music as well.
But Paul, that's just something that I'd never experienced before. As a composer, you usually send a cut and then they watch it and you all get together and talk about, we could do this and that. Paul, we would all get on a Zoom together. I would watch Paul watching the episode for the first time. And first of all, that was great, because if you're cutting, you get sort of like tired of it, but to watch someone else. So then there were certain times when we would come out of the scene and we'd all be like, wow, feeling that. But I got to have that experience in a fresh way with Paul.
But isn't that better? Because then I'm watching it, instead of having prepped it and going, this is what I'm going to say, or I'm going to tell Ron that his scene's wonderful. He can see me actually going, oh my God, I'm crying without any of that. I mean, it genuinely, I don't know about you guys, but when I was watching this, the emotions that it pulled. And so to have a chance to then write music with a quartet, with a piano, something that's really intimate rather than huge orchestra over kind of Hollywoodizing it almost, to have that intimate feel, to have these 3-minute cues, or the last cue of the whole series was, I think, 6.5 minutes. You don't get that chance. So, he was the man I loved. It's just wonderful.
I think this goes for all of you, but was there any sort of challenge in kind of establishing a through line? Because like you said, this was expensive, but also expansive. We see political intrigue of the 1950s DC. We see San Francisco during gay liberation. There's Fire Island. There's all sorts of locations and sort of different types of storytelling. And so I wonder what did it take to kind of make sure that this had a core of the story that you were telling?
Well, Mr. Mallon's beautiful book, which inspired the series, it is contained in the 1950s. And and Marcus and Frankie are not part of that book. And so two things I knew very early on is I wanted to have a black queer love story to parallel with our white queer love story. And because I didn't live, well, I was alive in the 50s, but I was an infant. So I wasn't part of the lavender purge yet. Although probably by the time I was 4 or 5, they were like thinking, it didn't take long for it to be revealed. But, I had definitely came out in the late 70s and had lived through that, and the AIDS crisis, incredibly foundational part of my life. And so I just wanted to tell that story too. And I just thought, how great to see Hawkins, Fuller, and Tim, and Marcus and Frankie go through all of that stuff. Yeah. And we just went for it. And luckily, as Matt has already said, again, kudos to Showtime and Fremantle, who just said, do more, be more ambitious, be more sexually provocative, which was just amazing.
Matt, like another way of putting it was like in playing Hawk in all these different situations, was there something you always came back to and like, I know that if I'm playing him in this scene, I can think of this and jump right into it?
It was such an education being in the pre-production of this for so many years, because I've been lucky to be able to kind of delve back into different aspects of LGBTQ history between Boys in the Band and the Normal Heart. But this really strung so much of our history together for me. And Ron was such an incredible educator and a gentle and intelligent and informative educator. So that was huge just going into it. And also just having so many of the scripts was so helpful. Obviously, as an actor, you know, it's boring to talk about, but there are a lot of technical things you do that are hopefully subtle. You know, I think I'm at a point now where I know a lot of people who are Hawk's age at his oldest age, and I know that you're not hunched over with a cane. You're still very much an alive and active human being, and so I think it's tricky to age through middle life. I think it's actually the trickiest phase as an actor to try to progress through age with, because it is very subtle gradations. So I had aspects of that, but I also had like a little kind of ritual I did with myself every morning before I started work. And there were different aspects to that ritual of preparation and sort of where his headspace was and kind of what his self-talk was and what his mantras and needs were at that time in any given decade, so that I had some kind of North Star, especially on days when we're going back from the 50s to the 80s in the same day, which were fortunately few and far between.
To truly appreciate Matt's performance and Jonathan's and Allison's and Jelani's and Noah's, is that, you know, obviously things are not shot in order, in chronological order. Actually, we don't even play them in chronological order in the show. But there were, you know, weeks where, you know, I would walk on the set sometimes and say, wait, is it 50s, 60s? What are we doing today? Oh, okay, it's 1979. Okay. But I didn't have to sort of embody it the way that these actors did. And that's extraordinary, because they do change throughout the decades.
But Ron was there. I think I did 96 out of 100 days on this shoot, and none of the days were shorter than 14 hours. And Ron was there every take of every single scene I did. And if I was ever lost, if I ever needed help, if I ever needed guidance, he was right there at the monitors. And for me, I've never experienced that kind of dedication from a showrunner before.
Obsession.
If he had asked me to, if he had asked me to stand on my head in the middle of one of those love scenes, I would have done it, because his passion and his commitment to this project was so great that I wanted to be a part of that.
That's the sequel. You'll stand on your head.
It's kind of the only thing left we didn't do, actually.
It is the only position left.
Oh my God.
So early too.
I know.
Lunch, anyone?
But in talking about that, I mean, Dan and Paul, is there any particular part that felt like the puzzle piece that was kind of hardest to fit in telling this like multi-decade story?
Well, from my point of view, it's not about the multi-decade story, because the soundtrack doesn't change as far as stylistically. We have, you know, I still recorded the quartet. We reversed it. So for the threesome in episode 7, when you're having your breakdown, and it's like, well, how am I going to do this? We've got a kind of funkadelic track going over the top, all high on drugs. It's going to feel really weird if you've got a quartet going underneath it. So recorded the quartet, but then reversed it, put it through phaser, and it's just gradually coming in underneath it. So that way you're kind of subliminally tying it in with the soundtrack, so it doesn't just sound like, here's your score, here's your source music, but it's kind of cool and it's a fun way to do it. But I would say that the only time I struggled was with the final cue. And I never know, like, it's right in the final cue. It's the hardest thing, because you don't want the show to end. And you talk about the trust that you had with Ron and the trust that you had with Dan. And for me, when someone gives you the creative freedom to go and do it, when you feel part of something which is bigger than the sum of its parts in the end, it's like, I kind of don't want it to finish, but also I don't want to write this cue. So it's kind of up there mentally. And I wrote this thing, and I played it to Ron, and Ron was like, I like it. I was like, what do you mean you like it? I put my heart and soul into this. And he's like, I feel you're holding back. You know, and I was like, well, I am holding back because, again, I don't want to overpower it. He said, yeah, but you've done all these cues which are 5 minutes long and diddle-a-diddle-a-dun, full on. Why aren't you really going for it in this? So I think it's a mental subliminal thing. So I went away, redid it, and it's one of the things I'm most proud of in my career, because it's a 6.5 minute cue, and you pushed me to do it.
And Dan, was there anything to directing?
I think it was the sheer scope of it. It was so much fun to read the scripts, and then we got to Toronto, and I was like, oh my God. how are we going to do this?
Fire Island.
And I Fire Island, Washington D.C.
San Francisco.
And have you been to Toronto lately? It's just all 1990s glass high rises. So there was that, and the sheer volume of what we wanted to do. I wanted to give Ron everything that was on the page. We went through and culled through a lot, but Matt can attest to like the intensity of what we had to do in a short period of time, and we did it. And I think every single thing that we shot is in those. I shot the first 2 hours. Is in those first 2 hours, except for one scene. They only deleted one scene. And I thought that was pretty remarkable because the volume of what we did was so impressive. And of course, we were setting up all the worlds. There was a great scene where after a cocktail party, all the women go downstairs and have dessert. All the men go upstairs and and smoke cigars in the study with Joseph Alsop and Roy Cohen. Shine are there, and Matt's character just completely lets them have it and makes the most inappropriate sexual innuendo. Makes a joke of these people, and this supercilious character Joseph Alsop, who has been hosting this party, stops him on his way out and was like, "You're going to regret that. You can't mess with these people." And sadly, I understood why Ron cut it, because it was never paid off later. But it was a remarkable scene. But the volume of what we did was the sheer volume of what we did, and the fact that it all ended up on the screen was really impressive.
I just want to say this. Paul, I was lucky enough to meet on this job and become a fan of, but Dan is on my DGA card. I was fortunate enough to study under him for a while on Versace and then direct on that show as well. And I knew he was the perfect director for this job. I knew we had a beautiful script. I knew we had a great team. But once I heard that Dan was going to be helming this, like, all my fears abated. I knew that I could just trust everything in the process, and the vision that he brought to this, and the tone and the visual palette between you and Simon, our director of photography, Simon Dennis, was just really remarkable. It just immediately transported you as an actor into the world of the piece. So thank you for coming on.
Also an amazing director, and we should see more of that.
Amazing, yeah. Is there anything about this that is like a small detail, whether it be a line, a costume, some subtle thing within a scene that we may not notice the first time watching, but means a ton to you, or you worked really hard on it and want to spotlight it right now?
1 hour in Washington, which is at the end of episode 5, I think it is. And we were recording in United Studios down the road, which is where the Rat Pack would record. And we went there specifically because of very geeky chat, but reverbs. So plate reverbs, it's how the kind of Rat Pack sounded like that. And so that for me was giving the soundtrack.
It was the room itself?
It's the room itself, and they pipe your music from the room into these weird chambers all over the place, which you then mic up, and that's kind of getting the sound of these reverbs. And then they put it back into the soundtrack. So it's like being in a church. That's what reverb is. You go like that. There's nothing here. But if you're in a room like the recording rooms they have. So we're like, okay, that's fine. So you recording the quartet, and you've got my piano and everything else, and that all gets piped through to these rooms, and then they're micing it up through there, and then that comes back in. But because it's 60s original stuff, the way that the wiring is done is probably not the best, and we'd accidentally pipe through your dialogue. So we're like, no, hang on, this is supposed to just be the music getting reverbed, and instead, really low down, there's the traffic outside, and there's your dialogue. And I was like, this is beautiful. This is absolutely beautiful. So if you listen to the soundtrack really, really loud, you'll do your head in, but you'll also hear the dialogue in there. But it's a wonderful mistake. And I was just like, mistakes are what makes life, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I have two things. One is the house party, when Mary has her house party, and it was just a magical. We did it very quickly, but it was just this magical moment where everybody got to improvise all the things that you see, and they were playing charades, they were dancing together, and you just got a sense of how these people really lived behind closed doors, but the fun that they had and the romance of it. It's one of my favorite scenes, and the other one is Hawk cruising in Lafayette Park. And they were just, to me, I was like, okay, we nailed it. Like, we got these right. Like, we actually built that Anastasia Massaro, our production designer, built that bathroom and placed it in this park in I don't know the name of it in Toronto, but placed it strategically in this spot, and that's where Hawk goes. And it's a contiguous set. It's a beautiful set, and I've just felt really good about those. Like, those were really important queer things that you don't get to see a lot in films and series, and we did great with them.
I have so many incredible memories from this shoot, but I have to say that the most overwhelming for me was probably the last scene, because we had the actual AIDS quilt flown in as a set piece, and I didn't know that we were going to have the real quilt there that day. And it was one of those moments as an actor that you just have to get out of your own way and realize how much bigger than you this story is. And it put everything into perspective. And I had 8 hours of material. It was one of the last things we shot. So I had so much material in all the relationships and all the squares I was looking at, not only Tim's, but, Cohn's as well. And it was completely overwhelming, and something I'll never forget in my life. And I kept a couple of totems. I kept the snow globe that Kenny gives Hawk, which is sort of this, it tracks with him throughout the entire series. And then I kept the cufflinks that Tim gives him. So.
Well, I'm going to subvert your expectations and not offer a line of dialogue. There's at the end of the pilot, Hawk has traveled to San Francisco in the 80s story, and to see Tim, sorry, I get choked up, who's dying of AIDS. And there's a beautiful thing that I had very little to do with. It is mentioned in the script where he is sitting in the diner, and he calls Tim from a payphone. He says, "I'm here. I'm going to give you the number, and maybe you'll call me." And he goes and he sits and waits in this booth. And the way Dan directed it and Simon shot it and Matt performs it, he's just sitting there and he's looking out this big plate glass window and he's watching San Francisco gay life on Castro Street go by. And because he's a genius, and that other guy over there is a genius, and Paul's score is playing, you understand everything you need to know about Hawk. He is thinking, I could have maybe been part of this, but I made certain choices along the way, and I'm not part of this. And yet my redemption will come if that phone rings. And how they do that without a writer in sight is a tribute to the power of film.
Thank you so much for sharing, you guys. Let's give it up for fellow travelers.
Thank you,
once
Marcus.
again.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.